Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 1.22, the Spanish-American War. It includes information that goes with section number 4 of your study guide. Now remember to use your study guide when you're taking the notes, and you control this lecture, so pause whenever you need to and rewatch if you need to. Bring your questions to class. Let's go ahead and get started. One of the early examples of American imperialism is the Spanish-American War in 1898. This war, dubbed a splendid little war by Teddy Roosevelt, was brief and relatively easy for the U.S. The U.S. defeated Spain, allowing the U.S. to be seen as a world power without a long, costly war. So, what caused this war? Well, there were several different causes for this war, but the underlying responsibility actually goes to journalists, newspaper reporters. These journalists, who were called yellow journalists, would exaggerate stories to gain readers. As newspapers fought over customers, the more sensational and entertaining the story was, the more people would buy your newspaper. Journalists sensationalized the mistreatment of the Cubans by the Spanish in order to gain support for the Cubans and to sell newspapers. Then, as the newspaper battles raged, the Spanish minister to Washington, D.C. insulted the U.S. president. The minister claimed the president was ineffective and would, or could, not do anything about the Spanish actions in Cuba. This insult against President McKinley enraged Americans. Finally, the USS Maine, which was anchored in Havana Harbor off the coast of Cuba. This is a military ship and had been sent to protect U.S. business interests as the Spanish and Cubans fought a civil war. The U.S. had several American businesses in Cuba and wanted to ensure that the Americans and their money were protected. On February 15, 1898, the ship exploded. Yellow journalists immediately blamed the Spanish, claiming the ship had been torpedoed. Americans became even more outraged and called for war. On April 20th, 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain. Now, I do want to note that today we know that the USS Maine was not torpedoed. In fact, a faulty boiler on the ship caused the explosion. But knowing that today does not change the war or its outcomes. The U.S. was able to beat Spain decisively very quickly due to a few key plans. First, they had ships in the Pacific ready to attack Spanish holdings there, including the Philippines and Guam. The Spanish had to prepare ships and send them with supplies around the world in order to fight the U.S. there. Second, the U.S. is a mere 90 miles from Cuba. This made supplying U.S. troops in Cuba incredibly easy and quick. Spain is across the Atlantic Ocean, putting a strain on their supply lines immediately. And the U.S. had the support of the Cubans and Filipinos, who had already been fighting Spain for independence and better treatment. With these advantages, the U.S. defeated Spain in just 3 months. One famous figure did make a name for himself in this short war, though: Teddy Roosevelt. He had been the Secretary of the Navy, but when war broke out, he quit his job and enlisted in a group known as the Rough Riders. Though none of their contributions to the war actually affected the outcome of the war, they made great press, and their ride up San Juan Hill became famous. This actually helped Roosevelt get chosen as the vice president in 1900, which led to him becoming the president in 1901. The results of the Spanish-American War were more impressive than the war itself. This war gave America standing as a world power. The U.S. had defeated one of the most powerful countries in the world at the time. That's impressive. The U.S. also gained some important new territory from Spain. Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, and the Philippines all came under American control. Now, this did not mean that all of the territories became a part of the U.S. The Teller Amendment actually promised that the U.S. would not annex Cuba. Annex means to make a part of the country. The U.S. instead helped Cuba to set up a government, write a constitution, and restore their economy and education systems. For 3 years, the U.S. maintained troops and a military government there while they set this up. Then Cuba became an independent country. Puerto Rico was never even given independence and remained a U.S. territory. In 1917, to avoid a rebellion by the Puerto Ricans, the U.S. granted all of Puerto Ricans American citizenship. This is how the relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico remains today. And finally, the Philippines had a very different situation in the Pacific. The Filipino rebels had fought alongside American troops to rid the islands of Spain. The Filipinos expected to gain independence after the war, but were made a U.S. territory instead. This enraged the people of the Philippines, and a bloody armed conflict ensued. This conflict, also known as the Filipino War, lasted for 3 years. Both sides fought with horrible brutality, leading to terrible losses. Over 4,000 Americans were killed and 16,000 Filipinos. 200,000 Filipinos were injured. While the conflict lasted officially for 3 years, the Philippines continued to struggle for independence until 1946, when the U.S. finally released their claim on the island. So this is the end of U.S. Notes 1.22. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in class with any questions you have.